Something happened to you recently, small, forgettable, a light in your peripheral vision that vanished before you turned, a dream so vivid you checked the room when you woke up, a feeling, persistent, irrational, that something outside your understanding has taken an interest in you specifically. Not in cities, not in governments, in you. I've spent years collecting testimony from people who reported exactly that feeling. And the longer I investigated, the more a specific and deeply uncomfortable picture emerged. These aren't ghost stories, these are patterns. And patterns, by definition, don't happen by accident. The question isn't whether you're being watched. The question is how long it's been going on. It always starts the same way. Not with a UFO sighting, not with a blinding light or a missing stretch of time, though those come later for some. It starts with something so mundane that most people dismiss it immediately, and that dismissal, I've come to believe, may be exactly what they're counting on. It starts with a feeling. I don't use that word lightly. I'm a researcher. I deal in documents, in timestamps, in satellite images, and declassified government memos. Feelings are not my currency. But when I began compiling first-hand accounts from individuals across 6 continents, people who had never met, who spoke different languages, who had come from wildly different cultural and religious backgrounds, one thing appeared in nearly every single testimony, placed right at the beginning of their experience before anything else had happened. They knew something was watching them, not fearing it, not seeing it, knowing it. A woman in rural Manitoba described it in 2019 as the sensation of being the only person in a photograph. A retired engineer from Osaka used almost identical language, unprompted in a separate interview recorded 4 years earlier. He called it feeling like the subject of a picture you didn't agree to take. These 2 individuals had no connection, no shared media, no mutual acquaintance. And yet their description of an initial awareness, that quiet cellular certainty that something beyond normal perception had turned its attention toward them, was, word for word, nearly identical. Once I noticed that, I couldn't stop noticing it. This is where the investigation begins, not with evidence of alien craft, not with radar returns or government cover-ups. It begins with you, in your own home, at 2 in the morning, unable to name exactly why you feel observed. That feeling is not random. That feeling is not anxiety. And the deeper I went into the testimonies, the more that opening sensation looked less like paranoia and more like accurate perception. Because here's the thing about being watched. Usually you're right. Humans evolved the sensation of being observed for a very good reason. It is, neuroscientists will tell you, one of the most reliable threat detection systems in the animal kingdom. When you feel watched, something in your environment has most likely triggered that response. A sound below hearing, a shift in ambient electromagnetic fields, a presence that your conscious mind hasn't catalogued yet, but your nervous system absolutely has. So when thousands of individuals independently over decades describe that same unmistakable feeling as the first sign, what are we supposed to conclude? That they're all wrong, or that something somewhere made a mistake in concealment? Just once, just enough for the human nervous system to catch it. The accounts I examined came from people who had no incentive to fabricate. A Finnish schoolteacher, a Brazilian civil engineer, a retired US postal worker from outside Flagstaff, Arizona, an accountant in Lagos, a grandmother in rural South Korea who had never, by her own account, expressed any interest in extraterrestrial phenomena before her experience began. These are not the people who go looking for this. These are the people it finds, and almost universally, they describe the same arc. First, the feeling. Quiet, persistent, unexplained. Then the anomalies begin, small, deniable, individually meaningless. Then the pattern becomes visible. And once the pattern becomes visible, something changes in the experience. The feeling intensifies, as though whatever is conducting the observation becomes aware that its subject has noticed. And here's the strangest part about that. In multiple testimonies, the moment of recognition, the moment the person understood they were being watched, was followed almost immediately by an escalation of events. Not a retreat, not a cessation. An escalation, as if being noticed didn't trigger caution on their end, as if being noticed was, perhaps, the point. I want you to hold that thought, because it changes everything about how we interpret what comes next. Let's talk about light specifically. Let's talk about light that behaves in ways that have no architectural explanation. In testimony after testimony, one of the first concrete physical signs people report is anomalous light behavior in their immediate environment. Not dramatic, not cinematic, not a beam from the sky. We're talking about light at the periphery of vision, light that appears in a room and is gone before the head turns, a glow outside a window at an hour when no neighbour's porch light is on, no car is passing, and the moon is in the wrong position to account for it. I documented over 200 accounts of this between 2015 and 2022. The specificity is what strikes you. These aren't people saying, "I saw something bright." These are people who, unprompted, often with embarrassment, describe a light at a very precise angle, always slightly behind them, always gone the moment they attempt direct observation. Always, not sometimes, not often, always at the periphery, always gone on direct attention. That's not a lighting anomaly, that's a behavioural pattern. And a behavioural pattern implies intent. Then there are the electronics. I began keeping a log of electronic anomalies reported in conjunction with the observation feeling. The list became, frankly, difficult to dismiss. Phones dying at full battery and restarting with no explanation. Television switching inputs without a remote in the room. The specific and recurring complaint, mentioned by dozens of people across different countries and different device brands, of a phone screen briefly illuminating in a dark room at precisely 3 a.m. or 3:33 or a.m. with no notification, no call, no app activity recorded in the device log. And here's where the official explanation begins to buckle. Device logs record everything. Background refreshes, push notifications, ambient light sensor triggers. These are not difficult things to capture in a system log. When I looked into several of these reported cases where the individual had actually checked their phone logs afterward, something most people don't think to do until later, the log showed nothing. No trigger, no explanation. The phone, according to its own internal record, had not turned on, and yet it had. 3 people I interviewed described walking into a room to find their television on and displaying a static channel. Not a channel they received, not a streaming menu, but visual static despite having turned the television off before sleeping. 2 of them had smart televisions that log every power event. In both cases, the log showed the television had not powered on. This raises a simple but critical question. If something can affect a physical device without leaving any trace in that device's own operational log, what kind of technology are we actually dealing with? Because that is not a glitch. A glitch leaves a trace. A glitch is, by definition, a malfunction within the system. What these logs describe is not a malfunction. They describe an absence, a gap, an event that occurred in physical reality and left no digital fingerprint. Think carefully about what that requires. Then there are the animals. Dogs, cats, birds. Multiple accounts describe family pets exhibiting sudden, intense alertness, directed at a specific point in a room, a corner, a ceiling, a window with no visible stimulus. This in itself is not remarkable. Animals detect things humans cannot. What is remarkable is the specificity of the behavior. These aren't animals reacting generally to an uncomfortable environment. They are tracking something, heads moving, eyes following, the precise ocular behavior of an animal watching a moving object directed at empty space. A woman in rural Queensland described her cattle dog, a working animal not prone to nervous behavior, sitting bolt upright in the middle of a night and tracking something across the ceiling of her bedroom for 40 seconds. before suddenly lying back down and going to sleep as if nothing had happened. She noted the time, 2:47 a.m. She noted it because it happened again the following night. At exactly 2:47 a.m., not approximately, not around that time, exactly, same corner, same duration, same abrupt return to calm. Once is a curiosity, twice at identical times is something else. I'm not telling you what that something else is. I'm asking you to sit with the question. And then there is the matter of physical sensation. Pressure, specifically a described pressure at the base of the skull or behind the eyes that several hundred testimonies name as a recurring physical sign that accompanies the observation feeling. Not pain exactly, not a headache. Pressure. The sensation, as one former military contractor in Nevada put it, of something tuning in. He was not being poetic. He was describing a physical experience that he had felt repeatedly over a period of 3 years, and that he associated with high confidence with periods during which other anomalies were also occurring around him. He wasn't the first to use that language, not tuning out, tuning in, as if the sensation is not coming from inside the skull, but arriving there from outside it. I've stopped trying to explain that one. I've started simply noting how many people independently reached for that exact same metaphor. The pattern at this point repeats with unsettling precision, not in one country, not in one demographic. Worldwide, across decades, in people who found each other only after their experiences were already complete. Time is supposed to be reliable. That's the thing about time. Whatever else goes wrong in your environment, whatever else becomes strange or unexplained, time is the one constant that should remain stable. Clocks agree with each other. Your sense of duration, while imperfect, doesn't vanish entirely. An hour does not become 2 without your noticing. 20 minutes does not disappear without a seam. And yet, the testimony pattern around time is, to me, the most difficult thing in this entire investigation to set aside, because it appears not just frequently, but with a specific signature that should not be possible if these experiences were simple confabulation or ordinary sleep disturbance. What people report is not lost time in the dramatic alien abduction narrative sense that popular culture has trained us to expect. It is subtler than that, and for that reason, I think more credible. It is the experience of sitting down to do something, make a cup of tea, read, work at a desk, and looking up to find that a duration of between 40 minutes and 3 hours has passed, during which they have no memory, no sense of transition, no record of activity. Not sleep. They are certain they were not asleep. Some were standing. Some report mid-action awareness. They were in the middle of reaching for something, and then they were simply somewhere else in the room, or the task was completed without any memory of completing it. This alone would be unsettling but arguably explainable through any number of cognitive frameworks. What makes it extraordinary is the documentation that some witnesses thought to gather afterward. A software developer in Edinburgh, who experienced repeated episodes of this nature over a 6-month period in 2017, began logging his computer activity obsessively during the periods in question. He kept his terminal open and running a script that logged a keystroke timestamp every 30 seconds. During a period when he experienced what he estimated as a 40-minute gap, the log showed uninterrupted normal keystroke activity at consistent intervals. He had been typing, consistently, for 40 minutes, with no memory of it. The files he had apparently created during that period existed on his hard drive. They were coherent. They were in his voice, his formatting style, his subject matter. He had no recollection of writing a single word. Now, there are explanations for this in the realm of dissociative psychology. I want to be clear about that. I am not dismissing them. But this man had no prior history of dissociative episodes, no relevant diagnoses, no history of trauma that might predict this kind of response. And the episode stopped, completely, abruptly, and permanently, following one particular night during which he also reported the peripheral light phenomenon, the animal behavior anomaly in his cat, and the pressure behind the eyes, all of it. Same night. Then silence. The silence that followed was, in his words, louder than everything that had come before it. I think about that a lot. The withdrawal, because it's not universal, some experiences continue, escalate, become permanent features of a life, but for a significant subset of the people I spoke with, everything simply stopped. One night, a kind of culmination, and then nothing. As if whatever the observation was for had concluded. As if something had gotten what it came for. What was it looking for? I don't know. I genuinely don't know. But the temporal anomalies don't stop at personal time loss. They extend into the documented record in ways that have nothing to do with individual psychology. Multiple witnesses who began keeping journals of their experiences, at my suggestion in some cases, or at the suggestion of researchers before me, noted that certain entries appeared to have been written by them in handwriting they recognized, describing events they did not remember, on dates that aligned with periods they otherwise recalled as uneventful. Their handwriting, their journals, their locked homes, their words, not their memories. I have reviewed photocopies of 7 such journals. 5 of them show the same characteristic. Entries that, on close textual analysis, read slightly differently from the surrounding material, not dramatically, not in a way you'd catch on a first read, but the sentence rhythm shifts. The word choices become, in subtle ways, more precise, more technical, as though the language was being used carefully by someone for whom it was not their primary medium. A forensic linguist I consulted, without telling her the origin of the material, flagged 3 of the 5 samples as showing possible authorial inconsistency, a pattern she associated with either collaborative writing or, in rarer cases, with the kind of linguistic drift seen in certain dissociative written output. She said, possible. She was being appropriately cautious, but those were her words, not mine. I hadn't led her to them. The material she was analysing had been written in locked private homes by people who lived alone. That's where the scientific framing starts to strain under its own weight. Because dissociation, whatever its mechanism, does not pick locks. And the entries were there in the morning, in the journals, in the handwriting, with no explanation for how they arrived. This isn't what we're told to expect from our own minds. This is something else. Here is what troubles me most. Not the individual experiences. Individual experiences can be rationalized. The human mind is extraordinary in its capacity to generate anomalous experiences, and I hold that awareness in front of me at every stage of this investigation as a necessary check on my own conclusions. What I cannot rationalize is the coordination. Not why these patterns recur, not when they were established, not under which framework they could all simultaneously exist without a common source. No, how? How do people who have never met describe the same experience in the same sequence with the same physical characteristics and the same emotional texture across languages, across decades, across cultures that have radically different conceptual frameworks for what is and isn't possible? Let me be specific. The sequence of signs that witnesses report follows an order. It is not random. It is not a scattered collection of weird events. It is, across testimonies gathered independently over 40 years of compiled research, a sequence. First, the feeling of being observed. Second, peripheral light anomalies. Third, electronic disturbances. Fourth, animal behavior changes. Fifth, the pressure sensation. Sixth, temporal gaps. Seventh, the cessation or the escalation. That sequence, in that order. In the accounts of a retired nurse from Christchurch, New Zealand, in the account of a philosophy professor from Krakow, in the account of a fishing boat captain from coastal Norway, in the account of a teenage girl from rural Guatemala who described it to a local researcher in 2009 in a village with no reliable internet access and certainly no exposure to Western UFO narrative traditions. She described the feeling first, then the lights, then her dog, then the gaps, then the nights of culmination. The same sequence once you map it out in the work of researchers from the 1970s who were compiling accounts that predate the age of mass internet communication entirely. Accounts from the 1950s. Accounts, if you're willing to push into territory that mainstream scholarship treats with considerable skepticism, that appear in the testimony records of several 20th century psychiatric institutions, patients reporting precisely these experiences and being predictably diagnosed accordingly. Not because the experiences weren't real to them, but because there was no framework yet for what they might mean. The coordination problem is this: for these accounts to all be the product of shared cultural narrative, the narrative would have had to exist before the accounts. But the earliest accounts significantly predate any mass media treatment of this specific experience sequence. The popular culture version of alien abduction, the one Hollywood gave us, looks almost nothing like what these witnesses describe. It's louder, more dramatic, more violent. The pop culture version involves bright lights and examination tables and missing persons reports. What these witnesses describe is quieter, more intimate, more like being studied by something that would very much prefer you not know you're being studied. That is a distinction that matters enormously, because the pop culture narrative, if it were the source of contamination, would produce witnesses describing the Hollywood version. Instead, witnesses, especially those with no significant prior exposure to UFO media, describe something that the Hollywood version gets almost entirely wrong. And yet they describe it consistently. If the common source isn't popular culture, what is it? There are three possibilities I can identify, and I want to lay them out plainly. First, this is a previously undocumented but entirely human psychological phenomenon, cross-cultural in nature, that produces consistent hallucinations in a consistent sequence. If this is true, it is among the most significant undiscovered phenomena in the history of psychology, and the fact that it remains undocumented is itself remarkable. Second, this is the result of something human in origin, some technology, some program, some ongoing enterprise, of surveillance being conducted by entities we could, in principle, identify, that produces these specific effects as byproducts or as intentional outputs. If this is true, we are already living in a world almost unrecognizable from the one we think we inhabit. Third, the witnesses are accurately perceiving something that is, in fact, occurring. Something from outside the acknowledged boundaries of human civilization is conducting individual-level surveillance on specific people, for reasons we do not understand, using methods that leave specific and consistent signatures in human perception and human environments. I'm not telling you which of those three I believe. I'm telling you that the deeper I went into the evidence, the more the first possibility seemed insufficient to explain the coordination, and the more the third possibility stopped feeling impossible. The evidence, in aggregate, suggests something operating at a scale and with a consistency that no single psychological quirk could account for, and no known human program has claimed credit for. So, what is it? If this is real, and I am not saying it is, I am asking whether it might be, then the record should show gaps, and it does. What I mean by that is specific. Throughout the mid-20th century, several governments maintained programs ostensibly dedicated to documenting anomalous aerial phenomena. The United States Project Blue Book is the best known. The United Kingdom's equivalent shuttered in 2009. The French GEPAN, later renamed and restructured. The Brazilian Operação Prato, the documentation from which was partially declassified in 2005 and promptly received almost no mainstream coverage. These programs documented sightings, atmospheric events, radar returns, physical trace evidence in landscapes. They were, in public framing, programs about things in the sky. What they were not officially about was people. But here's what the margins of these records show when you look carefully. In the released Blue Book case files, thousands of pages of which are available through FOIA, There is a category of case that appears with a frequency the summary statistics do not reflect. Cases in which the reported phenomenon was not a craft sighted from a distance, but an experience reported by a single individual in their home or immediate environment involving the specific elements we've been discussing. These cases were almost universally filed under psychological or insufficient data. They were closed, not investigated. Closed. Why does that distinction matter? Because insufficient data is a finding that implies an attempt was made to gather data and failed. But in case after case, the file shows no follow-up contact with the witness, no physical survey of the location, no electronic analysis, no interview with family members or neighbours who might corroborate or contradict. The case arrived, it was read by someone, and it was stamped. Gone. Operação Prato is more interesting still. The Brazilian Air Force investigation, conducted in the late 1970s in the Marajó Island region, was unusually thorough, unusually because it was conducted under military discipline with a genuine collection mandate. The released documentation includes physical photographs, medical records of affected individuals, and testimony from multiple independent witnesses, describing experiences that overlap in significant detail with the personal surveillance signature I've been outlining. Those files sat classified for nearly 30 years. When they were released, the officer who led the investigation, Captain Uirangue Hollander, gave one interview discussing what he had found. Shortly after that interview, he died by suicide. This is documented. This is not speculation. The timeline is a matter of public record, and I note it not to imply a cause, but because the record would be incomplete without it. The silence around that case in the years following the release was deafening. No major investigation picked it up. No academic institution published a substantive analysis. A man who spent months documenting anomalous experiences that affected specific individuals in a specific geographic region gave one interview discussing his findings, and then was gone, and the work he left behind collects almost no serious scholarly attention. That's not how important things disappear. That's how things are allowed to disappear. And what about the individuals themselves? The witnesses in these programs, in these files, where are they in the record? The follow-up on individual witnesses in the released Blue Book files is, in many cases, simply absent. People who filed detailed reports, who invited investigation, who provided contact information, and then nothing. No subsequent interview, no update, no case resolution. Did they stop experiencing things? Did they request no further contact? Did someone decide their experiences were no longer worth following? The files don't say. They're simply done. I've tried to trace some of these individuals or their descendants through available records. I've had mixed results. Some moved, some died in the years following their reports. A handful I was able to locate through secondary sources, and in 2 cases, family members of deceased witnesses confirmed that the individual had continued to report experiences until late in life, had never received any follow-up from the programs they'd contacted, and had become, over time, increasingly certain that what was happening to them was real. That certainty, in both cases, was described as a kind of grief. Because what do you do with that knowledge? If something has taken an interest in you, specifically you, your home, your mind, your time, and no one with authority is going to document it, investigate it, or even acknowledge it, you live with it. And maybe over decades you begin to understand something about your situation that is too large and too strange to give to anyone else. I tried to find a pattern in the witnesses themselves. I looked for commonalities: profession, geographic location, educational background, family history of mental illness, history of trauma, prior interest in UFO or paranormal phenomena, religious affiliation, age of first experience. I looked at everything I could access. What I found was the absence of a pattern, Not a single demographic thread that would allow me to say, these are the kinds of people this happens to. The witnesses resisted categorization with a consistency that was, by this point in the investigation, almost predictably strange. Some were highly educated, some were not. Some lived in cities, others were isolated in rural settings where anomalous lights or electronic disturbances might be expected to be more noticeable. Some were religious, some were committed materialists who found their experiences profoundly disorienting precisely because they had no framework for them. Some were young. The youngest witness I reviewed had been 8 years old at the time of his first account, which was recorded by his parents and later revisited by him in a detailed adult testimony given in his 30s. Some were old, some were in excellent health, some had conditions that might, in a skeptical reading, account for some of what they experienced. None of those variables correlated with the experience, any of them. I ran the question past a statistician who looked at the data without knowing its origin and confirmed no significant clustering on any variable I had tracked. So who gets watched? This is the question that the investigation cannot answer, and I believe it is the most important question it raises. Because if there were a pattern, if it happened to a specific kind of person, in a specific kind of place, under specific circumstances, we might begin to say something useful about cause and mechanism. We could point to a vulnerability, a trigger, a category, but there is no category, which means either the selection is random or the selection criteria are simply beyond our ability to perceive from the outside. And the idea that the criteria are invisible to us is in some ways the most unsettling conclusion the evidence permits. Think about what that implies. If you were being watched, you may have been selected for reasons you cannot access, based on qualities or characteristics that are not legible within human frameworks of understanding. You may be interesting to something for a reason that has no name in any language you speak. Several witnesses, in their later accounts, the ones who'd had years to live with and process their experiences, arrived at a similar place. Not an explanation, not a framework, but a kind of reluctant acceptance that they had been noticed, and that whatever had noticed them operated according to an agenda entirely outside their ability to map. One woman, a former academic from the Netherlands who'd had experiences beginning in her late 20s and continuing intermittently for nearly 2 decades, described it in a final interview I conducted as being an entry in a catalogue you're not allowed to read. She wasn't frightened when she said it. That's what I noticed. She said it the way you say something you've thought about for a very long time and made your peace with. Not resolved, not explained, but somehow absorbed into the fabric of a life that continued to be, by all visible measures, a full and functional one. She did say one other thing that I keep returning to. She said that in the last few years the experiences had slowed, not stopped, but slowed, and that the slowing felt, to her, less like an ending and more like a conclusion, as if something that had set out to learn something had, eventually, learned it. I asked her what she thought they had learned. She smiled and said she didn't know. She said she thought about it every day. She said that sometimes, in the quiet of very early mornings, she had the feeling, not a thought, not a belief, just a feeling, that whatever they'd found it worth keeping. I don't know how to close this. That's an unusual position for an investigator to be in. Usually, a long inquiry produces something, a conclusion, even a tentative one, a direction, a next question that feels more specific and more answerable than the last. What this inquiry produced was something different. It produced the sensation, and I'm aware of the irony in ending on a sensation, having begun there, of looking at something whose edges I can see but whose centre I cannot reach. Let me tell you what I know. I know that the accounts are real in the sense that the people who gave them experienced something. I am as certain of that as I am of anything in this work. The specificity, the consistency, the lack of cultural contamination in the earliest accounts, the complete absence of demographic clustering, these are not the signatures of mass confabulation. Mass confabulation follows social patterns, narrative patterns, media patterns. This doesn't. I know that the official record, where it touches on these experiences, treats them as a category to be managed rather than investigated. The stamped files, the closed cases, the witnesses who reached out and were never followed up with, that is not the behaviour of institutions that believe they are looking at nothing. That is the behaviour of institutions that have made a decision about what the public should and should not be invited to consider. I know that the sequence of signs, the feeling, the lights, the electronics, the animals, the pressure, the time, repeats with a uniformity that demands explanation, and that no explanation currently available within acknowledged frameworks is sufficient to account for it across the full scope of the testimony record. What I don't know is larger. I don't know what is being gathered from these observations. I don't know what quality or characteristic or data point in a human life is of sufficient interest to prompt this kind of sustained, patient, intimate attention. I don't know whether the individuals being observed are aware of their selection because something wanted them to become aware, or because something made an error, or because the observation has reached a phase in which the subject's awareness is itself part of what's being studied. I don't know whether the experience is benign. I want to be honest about that. The witnesses I spoke with were not, by and large, in physical danger. None reported lasting physical harm. But I am cautious about concluding from the absence of visible harm that the enterprise is without cost. When something studies you without your consent, without your knowledge, for purposes it has not disclosed, the harm may not be the kind that shows up in a medical record. The harm may be in what's taken. What's known about you now somewhere that you don't know is known. What's in that catalogue you're not allowed to read. Once you genuinely sit with that question, not as a thought experiment, not as science fiction, but as a live possibility about your own life, it changes the texture of experience. The way you notice the edge of your own vision, the way you relate to silence in an empty room at 3 a.m., the way your dog tilts its head at a corner, you start noticing the seams, and once you see the seams, you cannot stop seeing them. It's not a comfortable seeing. It doesn't resolve into clarity. It opens into a different kind of attention, a vigilance that isn't quite fear and isn't quite curiosity, but lives somewhere in the territory between them. Several witnesses told me that the investigation changed them more than the experiences themselves had. Not because they found answers, because they found that the question was far older and far more widely shared than they had imagined, and that the absence of public acknowledgement was itself a kind of data. What does it mean that we live in a world where hundreds of people across decades and languages and cultures have reported being quietly and systematically observed by something that is not human, and the response of our institutions has been consistently to look away? What does it mean that the people to whom this has happened are, in many cases, the most reliable witnesses I've ever worked with, precise, measured, deeply reluctant to make claims they couldn't support, and that their reliability has purchased them exactly nothing in terms of official engagement? What does it mean that I can sit here, having spent years inside this material, and feel, not believe, not conclude, but feel maybe that something about this investigation is itself being observed? I notice the periphery more than I used to. I keep better records now. I timestamp things. I make notes when I wake at strange hours. I've started watching my dog in the evenings. Maybe that's nothing. Maybe that's a researcher who spent too long in a particular kind of material and has let it recalibrate his normal. Maybe, but I also think about what the woman from the Netherlands said, about the catalogue, about something finding what it was looking for and deciding it was worth keeping. And I think about the question underneath that one, the question she didn't say out loud, but that I've been carrying since the interview ended. If they found what they came for, in her, in the fishing captain, in the school teacher, in the 8-year-old boy who grew up to give the most precise testimony I've ever recorded, what does that mean for whoever they come for next? What does it mean if they've already come for you? What does it mean if you recognized it, this feeling, this sequence, this specific texture of being known from the outside, As you read this, the file stays open. It always does.